Good morning, everyone. So, this week we are focusing in on the 1920s. And this is a decade that I kind of like to call a decade of contradictions. It's a period in which Americans are really battling to determine what kind of country they wanted to live in. And so, for the first part of today's video lecture, I'm going to talk about the cultural divides of the 1920s. And I hope you'll see by the end of our talk today how the 1920s was really not all that dissimilar to the kind of culture wars that we see happening in our society today. Now, in the second part of today's talk, I'm going to shift gears a bit to talk about the economy of the 1920s and how the seeds for the Great Depression are being sown well before the stock market crashes in 1929. So that's our agenda for today. And to start us off, I want to focus in on really this urban versus rural divide that was existing in the United States in the 1920s. We see kind of the continuation and the culmination, really, of the trends toward urbanization that began going all the way back to the late 19th century. And the city had begun to replace the countryside as the focal point of American life by the 1920s. In 1920, the National Census revealed that for the first time, the majority of Americans were now living in cities. Now, that was defined rather broadly as places with more than 2,500 people. But still, it did represent kind of an important shift. Americans were coming to the cities to seek jobs in the new consumer-based manufacturing industries. And the largest cities were the ones that were growing the most rapidly. New York, for example, grew by nearly 25%. Detroit more than doubled its population during the decade. And you see this in just the landscape of the city, the physical landscape of the city. Skyscrapers really were symbolic of this new urban mass culture. This is a picture here on the left of the Chrysler Building in New York, which was completed in 1930. And for about a year, it was the tallest building in the world until it was passed by the Empire State Building in 1931. So life in the cities was very different from the kind of world that Americans had known prior to this. Those older community ties of the home and the church and the school, those things were absent in the new metropolis. So all kinds of new ideas, new perspectives, new creativity were bustling and booming in the cities. And so throughout the 1920s, Americans really found themselves caught between urban and rural cultures. Urban life was considered to be a world of anonymous crowds, strangers, people out to make money and to seek out pleasure. Rural life, of course, was seen as being much safer, being a place where close personal ties prevailed, where hard work and traditional morality prevailed. And so it was really this divide between the urban versus rural communities of America that came to define the decade. And we're going to see how a lot of the things that we think about when we think about the 1920s, really we see this urban versus rural divide manifesting there as well. Now, much of what we think about when we think about the 1920s is the popular culture and the atmosphere of frivolity and pleasure seeking and excess that seemed to dominate the decade. In some sense, American popular culture was born in the 1920s because this was the first era of a national mass media. You had magazines, you had radio, you had movies. All of these things tended to kind of bind the country together culturally. Americans had more leisure time as well, and many people are determined to enjoy themselves and to, sort of enjoy that leisure time to the fullest. Sports becomes a national obsession during the 1920s. Particularly boxing and baseball become very popular. There's this sort of sense, especially after the trauma of the First World War, that there's this sort of yearning for excitement. And this prompted a lot of thrill seeking. It prompted kind of an obsessive interest in celebrities, all kinds of bizarre fads that swept the country during the 1920s. Very similar to kind of the viral videos that we see going on today. We also see standards of traditional kind of Victorian era morality begin to crumble, and sexuality becomes something that is more widely discussed in society. For example, movies in Hollywood in the 1920s are much more sexually explicit than they would be in the 1930s. Particularly among young people who are rebelling against the morality of their parents. They're using this sort of new culture, this new freedom, made possible in part through the automobile, to begin to explore sexuality, to begin to date, to begin to, sort of go out with the opposite sex. And so this is really becoming a very prevalent thing in American society. Uh, we also see this intellectual, cultural explosion of the 1920s that is very, very broad. And we see a lot of enduring contributions to American cultural life that come out of the 1920s. American literature, for example. Writers who are commenting on this new industrial consumer society, who are disillusioned by the First World War, who are, sort of going abroad and living in Paris and criticizing American civilization. People like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. And we see art and especially music making significant advances during the 1920s as well. Probably the most significant contribution is the spread of jazz music brought into American popular culture by African Americans migrating to the North. Jazz is really the first authentic national form of music. And it begins to be exported around the world. And jazz styles are embraced by white classical composers like George Gershwin as well. The migration, as I said, of African Americans out of the South and into the urban centers of the North and the Midwest, that continues after the First World War. Harlem, New York becomes the largest Black urban community. It's a place that is very, very poor. There's overcrowding, there's unemployment, but it becomes kind of the center of this literary, artistic, political movement known as the Harlem Renaissance. W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous African American intellectual, is one of the leaders of the Black community in Harlem. The NAACP moves its headquarters there. In 1923, the Urban League, which is another civil rights organization, begins publishing a magazine devoted to scholarly studies of racial issues. Ideas about Black nationalism and immigrating back to Africa are very popular at this time. This is sponsored by or headed by a Jamaican immigrant named Marcus Garvey. He created an organization he called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was a movement for African independence and Black self-reliance. And Garvey is eventually, he's very, very popular and has this massive following for a while. Eventually, he is considered, he's kind of run out of the country. He's deported after being convicted by the U.S. government of mail fraud. But he, sort of definitely has this massive following for a while, and it really speaks to this sense of betrayal and this new militancy among Black communities after World War I. The Harlem Renaissance was primarily a literary movement. It was led by very well-educated African Americans who were taking kind of a new sense of pride in the African American experience. Poets like Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, writers like Zora Neale Hurston, expressing the lives of African Americans in the United States, writing and focusing in on the culture of African Americans. African American literature blossomed in Harlem. And one of, sort of the most famous poems that comes out of the Harlem Renaissance was by the poet Claude Mackay, If We Must Die. And he wrote this poem in response to the race riots that were plaguing the country in the early part of the 1920s. And of course, the sort of most famous line of this is, If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. Like men will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. And this really expressed the kind of new sense of awareness and militancy among the Black community. Langston Hughes, of course, another very famous literary figure of the Harlem Renaissance. His poetry celebrated the Black working class experience and emphasized pride in sort of being Black and having an African heritage. The Harlem Renaissance included women as well as men. Probably the most famous female writer of the movement was Zora Neale Hurston. She was an author and a folklorist. Her most famous novel is, of course, Their Eyes Were Watching God. And she studied anthropology and ethnography, and she began to put her knowledge to use by highlighting and celebrating and trying to preserve traditional African American culture. This was concentrated, this kind of new cultural awareness of the Harlem Renaissance was concentrated in Harlem, but it was not exclusive to Harlem. It spread to other cities around the country with large African American populations, cities like Chicago and eventually Detroit. The number of African Americans graduating from college began to rise during the 1920s. So we really see kind of this flourishing of Black culture. The role of women in the family and in society is also changing during the 1920s. In 1920, with the passage of the 19th Amendment, women had finally won the right to vote. And a lot of Americans, both those who were in favor of women's suffrage and those who were opposed to it, had thought that women achieving the right to vote would bring about some sweeping changes in American life. But those changes didn't really materialize. Now that the amendment had been passed, the women's movement no longer had a kind of single unifying cause. And it begins to break apart into different factions who want different things. It was sort of assumed that women would all kind of vote together as a bloc to pass influential reforms. This was sort of the hope of the progressive era, but it turns out women didn't vote as a bloc together. Some parts of the women's movement continued to push for further equality. One of the more militant veterans of the suffrage movement, Alice Paul, she, after achieving suffrage, she organizes the National Women's Party, and she lobbies for the passage of an amendment to grant women full equality under the law, the Equal Rights Amendment. There were, sort of some problems getting it passed, though. Other women's organizations, mainly those who were interested in passing legislation that would protect women and children in the workplace, they were opposed to the ERA because they thought it would threaten that kind of legislation. So the ERA doesn't really end up going anywhere immediately. It has yet to actually be passed and ratified as an official amendment. Although sort of the push for greater political rights ends up kind of stalling during the 1920s, some women, particularly younger women, begin to move towards more cultural and social equality. And so this whole rebellion and kind of new sort of way of being, rejecting kind of older Victorian attitudes about how women should dress and how women should act in public. The flappers, of course, become this enduring icon of the 1920s. Young women are cutting their hair short. They're wearing shorter skirts above the knee. They're smoking. They're drinking in public. They wear makeup. They're dancing dances, sort of like the Charleston. And they're attacking kind of this traditional double standard in terms of sexuality. And we see the divorce rates rising dramatically during the 1920s. So we do see some real sort of changes in attitudes about the role that women could play in society. We also see a clash during the 1920s between religious and secular America. A lot of middle and upper class Americans, largely living in the cities, begin to turn toward what they called modernist religion. A religion that emphasized kind of social progress and good works, the idea of, going to church as being sort of a respectable thing to do, and sort of viewing the Bible more allegorically, more as kind of a historical document rather than sort of the actual Word of God. And this is part of a general trend in intellectual circles away from believing in absolute truths and toward a more relative, rational examination. And this is kind of grounded in this gradual secularization of American culture and society that we see happening in the 1920s. Against this are, of course, the traditional religious beliefs of millions of Americans who feel very alienated from the cities, from modernization, from science. And we see in the 1920s a growth of a movement in Protestant Christianity known as fundamentalism. Fundamentalists believe that the Bible is literally true. And so science really becomes a particular battleground for religious and secular Americans during the 1920s. This, of course, gets most famously represented in the Scopes trial in 1925. So according to fundamentalists, one of the ways that they were feeling like their sort of beliefs were being attacked was from science. Advancements in science that had happened in the late 19th and early 20th century were fueling kind of this process of modernization. Americans are increasingly putting a lot of faith in the authority of science. And there's growing acceptance of Darwin's theory of evolution. By the 1920s, evolutionary theory had started to be taught in schools. And so fundamentalists were very much opposed to this. They thought that the theory of evolution contradicted the biblical story of creation, and therefore they considered it to be blasphemous. So there was a big pushback against the teaching of evolution in schools. Several southern states turned to passing laws to keep the theory of evolution out of the classroom. And a law like this was introduced in Tennessee in 1925. It was known as the Butler Act. And it made it unlawful for any teacher in the public schools to, quote, teach any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible. Violating this law was a misdemeanor. It was punishable by a fine of maybe $100 to $500 for each offense. So it was not considered to be a super important crime or anything like that. But these laws started to be passed in schools around the country or in states around the country. And in response, the American Civil Liberties Union, which at the time was a relatively new organization who was kind of looking to exert its influence, they began to advertise for teachers who were willing to challenge the Butler Act in court. Then we see a group of civic boosters in a small town in Tennessee, the town of Dayton, Tennessee. They are looking for a way to boost their town's image, to draw people to the town. And so they see this advertisement by the ACLU and they think, aha, we can capitalize on this culture war that's brewing. And so they get the local science teacher, John Scopes, to accept the offer of the ACLU. Scopes was opposed to the Butler Act, and he, sort of was amenable to challenging this law. So the Scopes trial becomes more than just about whether or not John Scopes had taught evolution in his classroom. Supporters and opponents of the anti-evolution law, the national media, everyone converges on this little tiny town in Tennessee, Dayton, from around the country. Supporters bring in probably the leading opponent of teaching evolution, the renowned politician and orator William Jennings Bryan. He was a fervent Christian fundamentalist, and he had been opposing the teaching of evolution since the early 1920s. On the other side, the ACLU brings in Clarence Darrow. He's one of America's leading trial lawyers at the time, and he volunteers to sort of offer his services for the defense. Darrow was the kind of lawyer who loved defending unpopular causes, and he was an outspoken agnostic and very vocal critic of fundamentalists. And especially Bryan. So we have this showdown brewing between Darrow versus Bryan. And so this trial, which gets dubbed the monkey trial, becomes this media circus. It doesn't really matter, sort of what the outcome of the Scopes trial was, although it is a fascinating story of what happened during the trial. Scopes eventually was convicted of violating the Butler Act. He's fined $100. He never went to jail or anything like that. The trial doesn't really settle anything. Eventually, his defense appeals his conviction. It gets set aside on a technicality. The anti-evolution law stays on the books in Tennessee for the next 40 years. And both sides claimed that they had won. And we see this kind of divide between fundamentalists and secular Americans growing even wider. It sort of really comes to symbolize this divide between this battle between religion versus secularism. We also see this kind of urban versus rural divide coming in here, and we see it coming in as well with the passage of the 18th Amendment, launching the era known as Prohibition. The 18th Amendment made it illegal to make, sell, or transport alcoholic beverages all throughout the country. And this has been something that the temperance movement, the anti-saloon movement had been really trying to, push for a long time, ever since really the kind of mid-19th century. And it was very, very popular. It was very easily adopted in kind of rural areas in the United States. But the problem was kind of extending what they called this noble experiment to the cities. A lot of Americans, particularly people living in cities, are not particularly religious. They don't believe drinking is sinful. They are not, sort of really wanting to give up that pastime. It is deeply resented by immigrant groups for whom drinking is kind of an integral part of their culture. It almost gets totally disregarded by wealthy urban Americans who, of course, can afford to purchase illegal alcohol. The prohibition does actually, in fact, lead to a decline in drinking. There were many rural areas in the country that did become totally dry. In the cities, consumption of alcoholic beverages dropped very sharply among the lower classes who can't afford to buy illegal alcohol, but it becomes very fashionable to drink among the middle and upper classes. These are the people going to the speakeasies, these hidden saloons, or going to bootleggers to get illegal alcohol. It gets smuggled in from abroad, or it gets illegally made here in illegal stills, which is often a very dangerous prospect. One of the groups that capitalized on prohibition was organized crime. And it really ends up breeding a lot of disrespect for the law. Prohibition contributed to the growth of organized crime in just about every major American city. Chicago, of course, becomes notorious as the home of Al Capone, the famous bootlegger who takes control of the Chicago liquor business by killing off his competition. And it's also, prohibition is very difficult to enforce, partly because the federal government really never allowed or allocated enough resources to actually enforce the law. The task of enforcing prohibition fell to about 1,500 very poorly paid federal agents throughout the entire country, which was clearly an impossible task. So by the mid-1920s, prohibition was overwhelmingly unpopular. Only about 20% of the country was in favor of it. And it's very hard to legislate morality because people are going to do what they want, regardless of what the law says. Police in the cities openly trafficked, tolerated the traffic in illegal alcohol. Bootleggers are bribing judges and officials to look the other way. Prohibition was something that was sort of really born out of this rural desire, this rural American desire to control what they saw as the excess of the life in the cities. But America on the whole ends up suffering from prohibition, and it finally gets repealed in 1933. They have to actually pass another constitutional amendment, the 21st Amendment, to repeal prohibition. We also see kind of this urban versus rural divide in the growth of what becomes known as the Second Ku Klux Klan. This starts in Georgia in 1915, and its membership grows kind of slowly at first. But after 1920, fueled by the fears of the post-war era and some very shrewd promotional techniques, the membership in the Klan begins to grow. And it's primarily an organization of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men who are anxious about the way that their society is changing. The Klan of the 1920s is very different from the Klan during the Reconstruction era. For one thing, it is not confined to the South. It spreads to towns across the country. And in addition, it's substantially more centrally organized than the earlier Klan. There is a national leadership. There's a very highly structured hierarchy among that, sort of organization. Finally, the Klan of the 1920s was not just an anti-Black organization. Klansmen believed that there were many threats to what they saw as traditional American culture, including immigrants, Catholics, Jewish Americans, anybody who really embraced the free urban culture of the 1920s. So Klan members were concerned about what they saw as the demise of traditional moral values, the diminishing authority of men over women, the loosening of parents' authority over children. So it's largely a reactionary movement. It's largely an attempt by these white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men to protect what they see as their own values by force. And so they punish African Americans who sort of, get outside their boundaries. They punish women who embrace the new moral standards. They punish immigrants who fail to assimilate and conform. And very frequently used very violent tactics, including kidnapping, beating, murder. The Klan also entered into politics in the 1920s. They gained control of a number of state legislatures, and by 1925, there were around 5 million total members of the Klan around the country. This is really a symptom of this rural America that is feeling anxious and insecure in the 1920s. The Klan offered sort of a place to belong for people who wanted reassurance, for people who wanted to feel as though they were still important. And the Klan, just as it seemed to sort of be on the rise, it begins to rapidly decline by the late 1930s. A lot of the more violent activities of the Klan came to light and began to, sort of turn people off. There were a number of financial and sexual scandals that rocked the national leadership of the group. And so a lot of the rank and file members became disillusioned. And by the end of the 1920s, the Klan had kind of disappeared, gone back, sort of underground. But it's going to resurface, of course, again in the future. And the nativism and the intolerance of the Klan was really symptomatic of the general atmosphere of the decade. This is a period in which there's this enormous backlash to what a lot of people saw as sort of the modernization of the country. So hopefully this brief overview of some of the cultural divides of the 1920s has kind of showcased how this really was a decade when Americans are sort of battling with each other over what kind of country they want to see. Is this going to be a modern, secular, liberal society, or is it going to be a conservative, religious, traditional society? And we see these battles, kind of still playing out today, of course. Now we are going to shift gears a bit, and we're going to talk about the economy in the 1920s and how what happens during this decade really sets the stage for the Great Depression. So we live, of course, in a consumer society. We are living in a society that was, created in many ways in the 1920s. Our culture today is very centered around outward appearance, accumulating the latest devices. How many makeup tutorials or unboxing videos are there on YouTube? All of the ads that we see are kind of targeted to get us to buy things that the advertisers tell us will make our lives better, or at least maybe make them look better to other people. And this is even more true with modern social media, which is all about sharing your latest meal, your latest purchase, your latest trip, showcasing to the rest of the world how fabulous you look, how awesome your life is. The 1920s was very similar time. We can find the origins of this modern consumer culture in the 1920s. And we see this in kind of the ads in the 1920s. Historians who have looked at these ads have sort of seen that we see a shift in the way that advertisers are promoting products from more kind of an inner directed sort of focus. I can improve my lot by my life by working harder, by being more disciplined, by doing the right thing, to a more outer directed focus on appearance and personality. I can improve my life by being funny, by wearing the right clothes, by being able to talk about the right things. And so we see kind of this in some of the advertisements in this era. Particularly, these are some good examples here. As you can see, there's a lot more text in these advertisements from the 1920s than you might see in an ad today. They're much, sort of less visually oriented, much more, kind of, you have to actually read it to find out, sort of what's being advertised in some cases. But they are really appealing to people's desire for luxury, and also, kind of their fear of missing out. Like for this ad over here, some wives do it, but I wouldn't dare. And it's, sort of saying that, you're going to be able to, kind of properly, kind of hold on to your husband and feed your, family well if you use this product, Wheatina, which is a breakfast cereal. And I think it's, sort of really interesting to look at what these ads tell us about life in America in the 1920s, the kind of society that we're seeing here, the changes in culture, the changes in social norms and priorities. Above all, when we think of the 1920s, we think of this as being an era of enormous economic prosperity. And that can really be summed up in the famous saying by President Calvin Coolidge, "The business of America is business." We've been talking about the enormous growth in American industry in the late 19th century, and this process of growth and industrialization really culminates in many ways by the 1920s. Americans by the 1920s have the highest standard of living of any nation on earth. It's this huge economic boom. The economy is just going gangbusters. And it peaks by 1927 or so, and it really lasts up until 1929. In the late 19th century, we see kind of the power of steam being harnessed to run heavy machinery. By the 1920s, electricity is now the norm. It's replacing steam. By 1929, 70% of all industrial power came from electricity. The modern assembly line is introduced in 1913 in Henry Ford's auto plant in Highland Park in Michigan, and he perfects that later with his later plants. And other manufacturers began to copy his methods, and pretty soon moving assembly lines become standard in manufacturing. So the emphasis here is really uniformity, speed, coordination, being able to churn out all kinds of manufactured goods. And production per hour increases 75% over the decade. By 1929, the same size workforce as in 1919 was producing now nearly twice as many goods. This produces enormous profits, of course, for the manufacturers. It ends up also lowering prices on consumer goods. We see all these new technologies, meaning new industries. Having electricity in your home now meant that you could have something like a washing machine, a vacuum cleaner, refrigerator, an electric stove, all these kind of household appliances that are supposed to make life easier and ease the burden of housework. The radio industry, the movie industry is also booming by the 1920s. Americans are enjoying radios in their homes. They're going out to the movies. There's a whole spectrum of new products to buy. We also see kind of important structural changes happening in the 1920s to the economy as well. The corporation, of course, continues to be the dominant economic unit, but now those corporations are massive. They have thousands of stockholders. They are producing enormous profits. They no longer have to rely upon investment bankers. Now they're producing their own sort of, growth internally. We see, kind of a wave of mergers during the 1920s where you have, kind of consolidation of corporations, the largest corporations owning almost half of the nation's corporate wealth. There's also a new emphasis on marketing. The public relations and advertising industry really is born and develops during the 1920s. And advertising experts marketed consumption to the American public, identifying happiness and wealth and satisfaction in life with buying things. We see, sort of now kind of uniformity and standardization. A person living in rural Kansas can maybe buy the same kind of car, the same brand of canned goods, the same dress as somebody living in New York City. So we see kind of a regional cultures declining, different sectional or geographical cultures declining. The America is being sort of brought together, more sort of unified by consumerism. So the 1920s seems to be a very rosy time economically. Everybody is spending, spending, spending. There's lots of new industries, lots of new consumer goods. Everything on the surface seems to be great. But if we look a little deeper, we can see that the seeds for the economic collapse of the 1930s are planted and they are already beginning to grow during the 1920s. For one thing, we see this revolution in consumer goods masking a decline in a lot of the traditional industries that had really up to this point fueled the American economy. Railroads, for one thing, are suffering because there's all this competition from the growing automobile industry. The coal industry is facing the beginnings of the oil and natural gas industry. Synthetic fibers are now being developed in industrial laboratories, and they are declining. The use of cotton textiles is declining because of that. So we see some areas of the country really start to decline in the 1920s, particularly industrial New England. The oldest industrial center of the country begins to decline. Factories start to move south in search of cheaper labor. Thousands of people become unemployed. Farmers are also really suffering during the 1920s. During the First World War, American farmers had expanded their production to meet the wartime needs for both the United States, but also for Europe. The US is literally feeding Europe throughout the war. Once the war is over, those exports cut back. That causes prices to fall, causes farmers' incomes to fall dramatically. People working in the factories in the cities, they're better off probably than the farmers were, but they're still not fully sharing in the affluence of the decade. Even though the economy is growing, the industrial labor force is not growing in size along with it because all these technological innovations mean that the same number of workers can now produce much more than before. Wages also aren't rising very much. The biggest problem, though, is that organized labor is probably at its very weakest point during the 1920s. The leadership of unions that did exist were not very active. They were not really working to organize unskilled laborers in some of the big mass production industries. And after the strikes in 1919 and the Red Scare of the early, kind of 1920s, businesses are able to portray unions as these radical organizations. They're able to use the courts. They're able to sort of put forward contracts that forbade workers to join unions. Other employers use techniques of what was called welfare capitalism, basically spending some money to improve conditions in their factories, to give workers some benefits. This kind of was designed to try to make unions obsolete. So union membership actually declines during the 1920s. The middle and upper classes, though, are doing very, very well. people who are engineers, bankers, executives, they are the ones directing this new industrial economy, and they're the ones mainly reaping the benefits. Corporate profits nearly doubled, incomes are rising. All of this conspicuous consumption helps to fuel the prosperity of the 1920s. But disposable income becomes greater than a lot of people's material wealth, and this results in rampant speculation, people beginning to invest very heavily in the stock market. And as I'm going to talk about in just a minute, there's the advent of buying things on credit. A lot of people are able to participate in the new consumer culture only because they are able to say that they can buy something now and pay for it later. This results in increased consumer debt, which is going to be a big problem. All of these factors are danger signs on the horizon for the American economy, but there weren't a lot of people paying attention at the time. Americans are kind of caught up in all of this exhilarating economic expansion of the Roaring '20s, and they can't see that all this growth is very economic instability. Underneath all of this is a lot of instability. So when we're trying to figure out what caused something to happen, we're trying to really sort of look at the causes of the Great Depression here. When we're trying to figure out what's caused something in history, usually there are multiple causes. Very often, of course, people point to the stock market crash of 1929 as the cause of the Great Depression. But what caused the crash? So we're going to look at sort of this consumer culture. What role did advertising and consumerism play in causing the Great Depression? So I think we can look at this by looking at this ad here that's on the left. So this is an ad for Ford Motor Company. What do you see in this ad? How is it promoting the idea of purchasing a car? So we see sort of this headline, everyone owns a car but us, and it says, now you can own an automobile without missing the money, and now is the time to buy it. Through the easiest and simplest method ever devised, the Ford Weekly Purchase Plan. So this is something that's very new in the economy. During the 1920s, you have all these new credit firms offering consumers the opportunity to pay for goods in installments. Buyers could take out a loan to make a purchase or an investment, and then they would repay that loan at a fixed interest rate over time. So buy now, pay later, that was something that became very popular in advertisements and encouraged Americans to buy new consumer goods that they could not previously afford, like a vacuum cleaner or a refrigerator or a car. Before these installment payment plans, only the very wealthiest Americans could afford to pay cash down for an item like an automobile or a refrigerator. Buying on credit meant that many more Americans could actually afford these luxury items by putting a small cash payment down and then going on these monthly installment plans. The resulting increase in demand led to an increase in hiring, an increase in production, an increase in buying power. So this becomes a cycle, right? So production, consumption, production, consumption. At the same time, more and more Americans are going into debt. Some economists believe that at the end of the 1920s, about 60% of the cars, 80% of the furniture, and 75% of the washing machines and radios in the country had been purchased on these installment plans. But consumer debt is only really part of the story here. We also have to look at government policy and decisions by the courts, how these are affecting consumers in the 1920s. This is a flyer on the right here for a conference of the National Consumers League. And it suggests that the Supreme Court is making decisions in the 1920s that are having an impact upon consumers. This primary source is specifically related to a Supreme Court decision in 1923, the decision in Adkins versus Children's Hospital. So going back a little bit of background, in 1918, while the progressive era and all the reforms that the progressives were trying to put forward are still kind of peaking, Congress passes a law to set minimum wages for women and children in the District of Columbia, so in Washington, D.C. And so the question here that really was whether Congress had the power to regulate working and living conditions versus the right of people to not have their sort of economic affairs interfered with by legislatures. So Children's Hospital and a female elevator operator at a hotel brings this case to prevent the enforcement of the act by a man named Jesse C. Adkins and two other members of a wage board. So that's where the Adkins come in. They were part of a wage board that was designed to sort of set these minimum wages. And the court ruled in this case that passing this law regulating minimum wages, that Congress was not allowed to do this, that Congress could not pass this law regulating minimum wages because this was an infringement on the idea of liberty of contract. We've talked about this idea before. It's an idea that the Supreme Court was very heavily in favor of in the late 19th and early 20th century. During the Gilded Age and even into the Progressive era, certainly in the 1920s, the court begins to strike down state laws that regulated business on the grounds that they were interfering with the right of free laborers to choose their employment and working conditions. So under this reasoning, if a worker doesn't like that his employer requires him to work 12-hour days, well, he can go find another job, but he can't demand that the state government regulate his employer and require an 8-hour day. Now, in the case of Atkins versus Children's Hospital, the court is saying that the federal government, that Congress doesn't have the power to regulate minimum wages because to the court, the right to buy and sell your labor through a contract, that's a liberty of the individual that's protected under the Constitution. So as this flyer is suggesting, workers were not terribly happy about this. The court is handing down this decision about minimum wages, and it says this decision, the National Consumers League is arguing that this decision affirms your constitutional right to starve. So the court is not really on the side of the workers here. And throughout most of the 1920s, workers' wages are not keeping up with production. So a lot of consumer goods are being produced, and if the wages of the working class had kept pace, that would have been okay. But that didn't happen. Wages were stagnant for the most part. Henry Ford paying his workers $5 a day, that was an anomaly. And even at the Ford plant, not all the workers got $5 a day. And so the working classes couldn't afford to buy the goods that they were helping to produce. This eventually results in too much supply and not enough demand, and so prices are beginning to fall and the economy falls along with it. So the Depression is this big, massive shock to most Americans who thought that they had been enjoying nearly a decade of unprecedented economic growth. This consumer revolution had fostered confidence that things are just going to continue to get better. So when the stock market collapses, when factories begin to close, when unemployment begins to skyrocket, all of this optimism is just shattered. As I said, the seeds of the Depression are being planted during the boom of the 1920s. The production was growing faster than demand. More and more goods are being produced, not enough people can buy them. The problem was no one was really looking at this. No one was really far-sighted enough to see the warning signs. Corporate leaders could have responded to what became a slowdown in purchasing by raising people's wages or by lowering prices. The government could have forced people to stop buying things on credit, could have, cut back on loans. This might have forestalled the worst effects of the Depression. What actually happened? Well, when the economy started to slow down a bit in the 1927, 28, the Federal Reserve Board lowers interest rates. They begin charging banks less for loans in an attempt to stimulate the economy. Most of this individual credit goes into the stock market. People are taking out loans to buy stocks, which is a really, really bad idea. So this touches off a whole new wave of speculation that obscures this growing economic slowdown. People with all this extra money begin to invest that money in the stock market, and they're seeing the stock prices go up and up and up. In reality, not that many Americans actually owned stock, but the fact that the market is rising really captures the nation's attention, and it makes people feel like the economy is fine, that everything is going well, that the economy is healthy, and it prevents people from seeing these underlying flaws. So in 1929, October 1929, we start to see the beginning of the crash. Stock prices begin to decline for the first time, and investors get nervous and they start to sell. Speculators start to panic. This causes prices to fall even further. On Tuesday, October 29th, which was the date that became known as Black Tuesday, the market just crashes through the floor. Trading goes so fast that by the end of the day, the ticker recording transactions ran 2.5 hours late. And when the final tally could be read, it showed that an extraordinary over 16 million shares had traded hands, and the market had lost $14 billion. Within just weeks, all of the gains of the previous 2 years had just completely vanished overnight. As I said, the stock market crash really only directly affected about 3 million Americans who owned stock, but indirectly it spills over into the larger economy. Once the bottom falls out of the stock market, the economy begins to grind to a halt. Manufacturing output drops to levels lower than they had been in 1913. Prices dropped so low in farm goods that selling their crops meant that farmers would have to take a loss. So farmers are just letting their crops rot in the fields. By 1932, over 1 million people in New York City are unemployed. By 1933, which is really the peak of the Great Depression, the number of unemployed across the country had risen up to 13 million people. That's 1 out of every 4 American workers. People are unable to afford their rent. They're unable to pay their mortgages. People are becoming homeless. And it really becomes this sort of, massive economic downturn. And as we're going to see, it's going to have a, sort of real, impact upon the entire country. All right, so that's it for today. And for this week, you're going to be learning more about the 1920s and more about the beginnings of the Great Depression. We'll get more into that again next week, and I will see you all then.